Well, thank you. And good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me back to Toronto, but I must say you've done a pretty poor job with the weather. It was lovely when I arrived late Friday afternoon, and it's gone downhill ever since. However, I won't hold that against you. As Lucy said, individuals in our societies across the world are facing more and more complex choices in relation to their finances, as the states roll back the provision that they make and individuals are expected to make provision for themselves. Moreover, financial services themselves have been developing, so that it's an ever more complex marketplace for an individual to negotiate. And it's against this backdrop that we've seen the developments that we're going to be talking about, at least in this session, I guess, for the whole of these 2 days. So, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've been on a very interesting journey, both in terms of thinking and in terms of practice. A journey that's much more than a semantic one. We've moved from financial literacy in the very early days through to financial capability, and now more recently, financial well-being. And that's what I would like to focus on in this first session. If we start with financial literacy, well, the traditional approach in the early 2000s was one which had a focus primarily on knowledge, and then a little later on skills as well, and a belief that financial literacy can be taught in the classroom. It was a didactic approach. People who were seeking to measure financial literacy in populations adopted what we researchers call a normative approach. In other words, they decided what ordinary citizens ought to know, and then went out to measure whether they actually knew it. There was nothing terribly empirical in it, and nor was there much of a consensus about what ought to be measured. And those very early surveys came up with a single number. It was a single measure of financial literacy based on how many right answers you got in those very simplistic questionnaires. That was where we started from, and that was now about 15 years ago, and we've come an awful long way since then. Well, the critique of this approach came from policymakers, and it also came from academics, and particularly from the behavioural economist sitting in this hall. I'm sure a lot of the thinking came out of this institution as well. A criticism, really, that knowledge and skills shouldn't be seen as an end in their own right. Lots of evidence that people knew all the right things, they knew what they should be doing and still did the wrong ones. There was a feeling that the primary concern should be on consumer behaviour, not least because the evidence of the impact of knowledge on behaviours was mixed at best. And very often we could see very little correlation. Indeed, it wasn't even easy to see which way the causality was running. Were people exhibiting behaviours because they got better levels of knowledge, or did they acquire that knowledge through the behaviours they were engaging in? So this was the critique at the time. And also a very strong case being made that behaviour is largely influenced by factors that can't be taught. So we have inbuilt behavioural biases, psychologists call them psychological traits, two different disciplines, economics and psychology, but basically exactly the same things being talked about with different labels. They're also influenced by beliefs and by social norms. We don't exist in isolation. We all operate in the societies in which we live and are moulded by those societies. And I hear many criticisms of young people being particularly feckless, and I think it behoves us all to realise that actually if we were young now, we would be behaving in just the same way. And also, of course, behaviours are affected by the environment in which we live. The environment in which consumption is king, where advertising, yes, Black Friday and Cyber Monday, it's all designed to encourage us to spend and spend recklessly and to borrow in order to spend. So this critique gave rise to the new concept of financial capability, led at first by the UK regulator, the then Financial Services Authority, back in 2005, when we have Nick, who's now the head of research from the successor body, but the head of that the research department of the FSA came to me and said, we want to carry out a survey to measure levels of financial capability in the UK. Can you design us a questionnaire? And I said, well, we can give it a try. How do you find financial capability? And he said, well, that's the problem, you see. We can't define it. So I took a deep breath and said, okay, so you want me to go out and measure something you can't even define? Okay, that's a bit trickier, but let's go right back to basics. Well, we started with a lot of qualitative research, asking ordinary citizens, all ages, all income levels, define a capable, financially capable person to me. Define an incapable person to me, because they weren't necessarily mirror images of one another. And the results were extremely interesting. That approach was adopted by Canada quite soon afterwards, and by a number of others as well. And subsequent to that was picked up by the World Bank and developed for low and middle income countries, where we refined the questionnaires, but actually we went right back to first principles again and conducted, would you believe, across 9 countries, 120 focus groups. The biggest number I've ever had to do, but we needed a large number across a swathe of countries, across continents, to understand what financial capability meant if you lived in a low-income country. It may not be the same thing. In fact, miraculously, it was almost identical to what people in low-income populations of the UK, Ireland and Canada had been saying. Remarkably similar. So some very common threads. It focuses on behaviour and the factors that influence them. People were telling this in very graphic terms. And they were saying that the factors that influence them include environmental ones as well as individual factors, things to do with the individual, but things to do with the society and the environment in which they operate. It was essentially a qualitative approach, as you can tell from that vast amount of not only large numbers of focus groups, but incredibly huge numbers of cognitive interviews to test the survey instruments, both in the UK. Actually, we repeated, I think, in Canada. We certainly did in Ireland when I worked there. And then with the World Bank, we did lots and lots of cognitive testing. Fascinating, really fascinating, across different cultures. You can't ask people about being able to resist temptation in Catholic countries, apparently. In South America, it conjures up humorous images of the devil. So we had to abandon some well-trodden questionnaires from the psychological literature, trying to apply this from Uruguay through Tanzania to Papua New Guinea was the biggest challenge I'd ever had in my life, but one I enjoyed enormously. Some fabulous teams we worked with. It became clear from all that analysis that we weren't talking about a single concept, but a number of loosely connected behaviours. There was agreement about how these should be measured. Generally, people were buying into the consensus of what sort of things make a capable person, what makes an incapable one. And it was also quite clear that behaviours were driven mainly by attitudes and personality, and that so they were less amenable to formal education. The critique of this was started actually by a colleague of mine then at the World Bank, who kept saying to me, why are we doing this? Why does it matter? You know, why does any of this matter? And I kept saying, just shut up, Robert, shut up. I've got enough problems. I'm trying to deal with these 9 countries. Have you tried doing fieldwork in Papua New Guinea? It's nigh on impossible. Women had to make their own raft to come down the river to join our focus group. So I just kept shutting him up, but it kept reverberating in my own mind. So the critique of this approach is mine, of my own work. And frankly, I got it wrong. In the analysis, I got it wrong. And what I was doing was confounding capable behaviours with capable outcomes, because people were describing a capable person in terms of what they did, but also what they achieved. Once I had that light bulb moment, it led me to rethink all that I'd been doing. Oops. So what I realized was that I needed to separate out the behaviors, which are the financial capability, the capable behaviors, from the outcomes, which I believe is financial well-being, financial wellness. And that really we needed to look to see what was ultimately driving financial well-being, because Robert was quite right. Why are we doing all of this? Well, we're doing it because we believe that people's financial well-being will be enhanced by it. And so we do need to understand what is driving it. And let's forget all this dichotomy between literacy. Is it knowledge? Is it attitudes? Is it behaviour? Let's test it all empirically. And that's what the new wave of surveys did. I went back to all the scripts that I had from the UK, from Ireland, and from the World Bank studies, and I reanalyzed them to separate out the outcomes from the behaviours and the other factors, and grouped them really into, at that stage too, being able to meet all your current needs comfortably with a clear margin, not just subsistence, but having resilience to maintain that in the future. So in other words, as I say, a set of outcomes. It was also clear from the qualitative research that these outcomes are determined by the interplay between a range of factors, including behaviours, knowledge and skills, attitudes, motivations, behavioural biases, but also, importantly, a range of environmental and economic factors. So we came, actually I should also say I'm claiming total credit for that, and I shouldn't. I was working very closely with people working at the CFPB in the United States who were conducting their own qualitative research to explore what is financial well-being. And we agreed to work very closely together, but to do our work independently, and then to see what resonance there was between the two sets of findings. And there was almost a complete match. We realised that what we had each come up with was the same conceptual framework. Their definition differs very little from the one that I've got on this slide here, and their approach differs very little as well. So our definition, working definition, I should say at this stage I was working with colleagues in Norway. Why Norway, people ask me? Why would they be worried? Simple answer is they had money. They had a ministry that was prepared to put the developmental money into doing this, and Christian Popper, who I've worked with for about 25 years, but on this for the last 3-4 years intensively. He was able to unlock this money and persuaded me we should start exploring these ideas empirically and building conceptual models. More academic than I'd been in the past, I have to say. I was more quick and dirty, let's get on and get the results before. So, definition of financial well-being, well, it's being able to meet all one's current commitments, to do so comfortably, and having the financial resilience to maintain that in the future. And I think few of us would refute that very simple definition. Christian and I also came up with this conceptual model, really to help us think about how we might approach the analysis. But it was based on the qualitative research, which was telling us that the prime drivers of financial well-being are behaviours on the one hand and these environmental factors on the other, and socio-economic environment in which individuals operate. But that those behaviours would be driven largely, the qualitative research said, by financial attitudes, behavioural biases, personality traits, and confidence. And that it would be, the personality traits rather would be feeding into those attitudes. Knowledge and experience, people were telling us in the focus groups, was likely to be secondary, and were giving us many examples of where people knew what to do and still did the wrong thing, and also, equally, had very little education. In P&G, people were totally illiterate, let alone innumerate, and yet they were still managing the money extremely well. So it was a more complex relationship that we had to deal with. So we surmised that it would have an effect, and indeed it does have an effect, but it can be overridden by attitudes and personality. So, to the international measurement of financial well-being and capability. The survey, as I said, was developed in Norway in 2016-17. The ministry liked it. I must say they still don't know what to do with it, but they liked the survey, and so they gave us more money to repeat it. Now, normally you wouldn't bother repeating every year because things don't change much, but we could see deficiencies in the questionnaire, so this was a God-given opportunity to improve on the survey instrument, which we did. And the most recent one was conducted late 2017. The questionnaire includes questions to capture all the various levels in the conceptual model. So we ended up with, well, I should explain, we had the very detailed questionnaire, though it doesn't take that long and can be administered online. But we used principal component analysis to identify underlying measures. And so we ended up with 4 measures of financial well-being, 8 behaviours, and you can see what they were here, 4 on money use, 4 on money management, as well as different aspects of knowledge, personality traits, and a range of other factors. The first 2 countries were to pick up the work that I was doing were Australia and New Zealand. I have worked quite extensively in Australia over the years, very closely with ANZ Bank, who have spearheaded a lot of work and financed a lot of work in Australia, even before the government and the regulator had any interest at all. And unknown to me, they also fielded it in New Zealand, so that came as a bit of a surprise to me when they presented me with the 2 reports. The third country to pick it up was Ireland. They had approached me to repeat a survey I'd done in 2006 for them of capability, and I explained that thinking had moved on. They will be publishing in 2 weeks' time. It's taken them an age to get it through the procedures of the Irish government. And then most recently, Canada, and congratulations, you overtook them. You started later. In fact, we couldn't start your work until we had completed the Irish, and yet they're not publishing for another 2 weeks. So we've got a wealth of internationally comparable data. For the first time in my career, I've actually been able to collect really good data. Well, actually, the second time, the World Bank gave me that opportunity across low and middle-income countries. But now we've got some, to my mind, much improved data, and we have some fascinating and valuable findings, as you're going to find out in the next session. Thank you very much.